You clicked on the video, you saw the time length, and you thought, yeah, let's hear this jabroni give his take on the Nintendo exclusive, the Duskbloods. So now it's time to reap what you have sown. Here's what we're going to do in this video. I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of things, the Duskbloods included, obviously, but also Fromsoft's situation as a whole. And I also want to touch on a bit of a multiplayer trend that we've been seeing in the gaming industry lately, because since I've started writing this script, everyone and their brother have announced that they're working on an extraction shooter, and I think that points to something larger in the industry. I'm going to do all of this while I show you footage of me shooting people with an actual glintstone gun in the popular mod seamless co-op in the popular game Elden Ring. And hopefully by the end of this you understand that while I'm never going to buy a Switch 2 in my life, I think the Duskbloods is overall a great thing for From Software. For frequent viewers of this channel, this isn't technically part of the Age of Mage. That series is still ongoing. I've just been doing a lot of invasions with this particular character, which is my Celion Onryu, which I can safely say is my favorite build that I've made in Elden Ring. It seems that a winning archetype for my favorite build in each FromSoft game tends to be evil bitch that kills people with a magic-infused sword. I'm still waiting for that archetype to show up one for one, either in Nightreign or the Duskbloods. Closest I'm going to get in Nightreign is probably the Recluse. Still holding out hope for that archetype to show up for the Duskbloods. Let's zoom out a little bit. If you look back at every FromSofty PvP, there's always some giant glaring flaw that you kind of just have to get over in order to enjoy it. It's really not hard to get over these flaws a lot of the time because they're usually like extremely overblown. And I say that as somebody who once made an hour-and-a-half video on how vestigial the multiplayer of Elden Ring is. Like, just reading that sentence back now makes me cringe a little bit. Personally, I find it pretty easy to dive right into the PvP of any FromSoft game I've decided to play while I do like a normal run. So I'll do a normal run, invading or fighting invaders as I go, then usually sticking around the PvP scene for a few weeks with that same character. This tends to happen a lot with like the Return to Lordran or Return to Drangleic events, where I'm really only playing the game for about a month in total. And honestly, the trick to actually enjoying these games' PvPs is just to avoid meta levels if you want to avoid the most miserable players of each game. We all know misery begets misery, so like why interact with those players if you don't have to? But nonetheless, each game does have some glaring problems with its PvP system that people like to harp on. I'd ultimately say most of these issues don't really matter except for anything that greatly affects activity. In a previous draft of this video, I devoted quite a bit of time going over the cons of each FromSoft game's PvP, and then talking about how the pros of those games outshine the cons. When I got to Bloodborne, the list of cons just kept being directly linked to the game's activity, and I'm starting to get worried that a lot of this will also apply to the Duskbloods. The glaring flaw of Bloodborne PvP and Bloodborne as a whole is that it's a console exclusive, pure and simple. The player base is automatically cut in half, if not more, since Xbox players allegedly exist. Activity is also lousy because a lot of people who play Bloodborne don't pay for PS Plus, which is the subscription to Sony's online services. And thus many Bloodborne players just aren't playing the game online. Outside of activity, Bloodborne is also locked at 30 frames per second due to being stuck on the PS4 and never being updated. But we all know this because it's the only thing the internet wants to talk about when it comes to Bloodborne. So as of now, we only know a few things about the Duskbloods. But right off the bat, it seems to share quite a few of these glaring flaws with Bloodborne. It's going to be a console exclusive that's actually going to cut the player base by an even larger degree, now cutting out both major consoles and PCs. I know quite a few of you will likely buy a Switch 2 solely to play this game on it, but a lot of us can't really swing that large of a purchase in this economy while also already owning a console or a PC for only one game. Also, fun fact, Nintendo is the only console maker that actually sells their consoles for a profit, something Sony and Microsoft stopped doing a whole console generation ago. I'm not really faulting Nintendo for that, but I kinda am. They totally could afford to do that, and they just won't. It's the same reason they're charging $80 for Mario Kart. It's because they can. People will buy it. Back to the Duskbloods. Nobody is going to be playing this game offline in the first place, so I'm not even going to touch on paying for Nintendo's online services. but I am worried about what frame rate this multiplayer game is going to run on a handheld console. The handheld console thing gives me a lot of pause in general, which I'm sure it does for everyone else as well. Fromsoft's netcode combined with the online services, quality, and general Ethernet cablelessness of Nintendo seems like a match made in hell. But all that being said, I do think there is a rhyme and reason to why this competitive multiplayer game is going to be on a handheld console in the first place. Recently, in an interview, Miyazaki mentioned that this game was in development when Nintendo approached them about funding the rest of the game. Here's the thing though, games get started in development all the time, and especially at larger companies like Fromsoft is nowadays post-Elden Ring, a lot of them get cancelled internally because of various financial evaluations. So when given a choice between a game getting left on the cutting room floor and actually getting published and released, as a game studio, you always choose the latter, even if that means making a game a console exclusive even when you'd rather not. Does putting a multiplayer-only game on the Switch 2 make a whole lot of sense for FromSoft sales-wise? No, not really, but getting your experimental multiplayer game partially funded and released is the bigger outcome for them here. This move also makes sense for Nintendo because they don't have a lot of good online multiplayer titles that would entice people who weren't planning on buying the Switch 2 to actually consider that purchase. Sure, they have Smash players and they have, I guess there's people who are really into online Mario Kart, but those people were always going to buy the Switch 2 in the first place. It also sounds like Nintendo is making some sort of an attempt to improve their online multiplayer features with the Switch 2, but I'll believe it when I see it. What's most surprising to me about all of this is that Nintendo has chosen the Duskbloods as their game to fund and not Nightreign, which seems a lot more of like an arcadey game that fits Nintendo's general brand. This is likely just a timing issue though, as Nightreign is much further along in development and will be launching next month, whereas the Duskbloods has a nebulous 2026 release timeframe at this point, which lines up a lot better with the Switch 2's launch. Ultimately, this is a set of, I'd say, pretty smart business decisions by both parties involved. Fromsoft gets their kind of odd multiplayer game funded that, I don't know, is very out of their wheelhouse. Like, it's the kind of game that if you had to make some hard decisions about which games you were actually going to pursue, I feel like something like the Duskbloods would be the first thing that you cut as From Software because you've never made a game like this. It's not really what you're known for, so sales might be a little bit iffy. But to get this game funded is great. Like, this game will actually get made, and Nintendo gets a console exclusive that will actually, make people think twice about whether or not they're gonna buy a Switch 2. I know I did right off the bat. I had to think about it for quite a while. I ran through can I afford to buy this? Are there any other Nintendo games that I really want to play? And the decision really came down to, I just don't want to spend $450, $500 for a console to play one game. Now, there's other people out there who, this is the tipping point for them. They were like, oh, I'm kind of on the fence for the Switch 2. Oh, the Duskbloods is going to be a console exclusive? Okay, yeah, I'm buying one. That's exactly the kind of player they're trying to buy over with this move. While I will not be buying a Switch 2, please do not get it twisted. I am very excited about the potential of the Duskbloods, and for a couple of different reasons. First off, I'm not even sure what a multiplayer-only FromSoft game even looks like, and I guess we'll find out soon enough when Nightreign launches, but beyond that, what does the support for a FromSoft multiplayer game actually look like? Are they going to insist on cryptically tweeting on random Tuesdays? Are the patch notes going to be vague nonsense such as increase the power of certain attacks, leaving the community to figure out what the hell they actually meant by thoroughly testing it? Online games require some pretty diligent patching. If we have something absurd like the Fire's Deadly Sin glitch, which took months to get patched out, or the Chainsaw glitch, which took over a year to get patched out, how long is it going to take FromSoft to patch something out of this game? What if something is just horrifically overpowered, like Rivers of Blood was for, most of the base game's life cycle? I think 6 to 8 months after the game launched, you would just get effectively shredded by anybody using Rivers of Blood. What about something that's just kind of broken and powerful, like Moonveil, which has only ever received a very light nerf? Is that the kind of thing that FromSoft would patch out or tweak dramatically for the Duskbloods? My question really boils down to how fast and how effectively will Fromsoft be patching these games? Another line of questioning. How are they going to handle the servers of this game? Are they going to have their usual peer-to-peer server system, or are we going to get like dedicated servers hosted somewhere? I'm not sure how they handled things for the network test for Nightreign, but I would assume it would be something similar. So I'm curious how that's going to play out long-term to a player base of potentially millions. Okay, don't worry, we're not done with the questions yet. Like, what does a FromSoft combat system look like when it's actually designed for PvP? The closest we've seen is probably Dark Souls 3's PvP, which had a clear system for how it wanted to handle hit stun, and how PvP damage reflected that 2-hit system. I think DS2 also handled its core PvP combat fairly well. Personally, I find it to be incredibly accessible and easy to learn, whereas Dark Souls 3 has considerably more depth, which I kind of prefer. The Duskbloods combat system has to fare well in both PvP and PvE, I'd say for the sake of like consistency, but mostly for this game to be actually fun, so I'm really curious, what's that actually going to look like? Also, what is Masaru Yamamura working on right now? He was the combat designer of Dark Souls 3, a lead designer on Sekiro, and the co-director of Armored Core 6, so are they working on the Duskbloods, or are they getting another shot at directing a different game? I don't see their name connected to Nightreign at all, so I'm kind of assuming maybe they're working on the Duskbloods, but who knows. Either way, I just want to commend that person for being a truly excellent combat designer, and I can't think of anyone else I would love to have on a full-fledged PvP game. You're probably really tired of me just like rattling off the millions of questions that I have about this game, but for me, like all these questions being asked has so much potential in them being answered that could really carry over so well into future main Souls titles. Generally, I just don't think multiplayer was a huge point of emphasis for Elden Ring. Given what little we know about the development of the game, it seems like they were planning something more like a spin on Shadow of the Colossus, with their usual format that just ballooned into a full-fledged open-world game, and they simply didn't have time to update their multiplayer systems to accommodate the full scope of the world. But I think there's something that's just so encouraging about the next two games being multiplayer focused for FromSoft. Instead of a spin-off game and then a full-fledged Souls title rotation like they've been doing since Dark Souls 3, we're getting back-to-back spin-off games that are solely focused on multiplayer that will hopefully help them hammer out a new multiplayer system that fit with the scale of the games they're making now. And the fact that Miyazaki has stated he's aware of stuff like seamless co-op mod and finds it interesting is, I don't know, very encouraging to me. I don't expect them to implement it fully, but it's nice to know that they know people are eager for a different multiplayer system than the one they currently have. I asked a million questions to start this section of the video because I think the potential of these questions actually getting answered could be huge for like mainline Souls titles down the line. A large part of my excitement for Nightreign is I look at all the stuff that these characters are doing, and I don't expect them to just carry that right over and the next Souls game is going to have like a really fast sprint or like everybody can wall climb. But I do see all of these animations that they're making and all of these different abilities, and I am fascinated by what they're going to carry over and what they're not. Every time I do a like return to Lordran, I'm always reminded of how different each build type feels in the way that they move in that game, and that's something that's really exciting to me about Nightreign. Each character seems to have their own like dodge animation, and I would just love a full-fledged Souls title where each character build type that you're making feels dramatically different than like a different one. Like a mage should feel dramatically different than a full plate armored strength character. And in Elden Ring, that's not the case a lot of the time. A lot of builds like play slightly differently in how you approach things, but they all kind of feel the exact same at their core. I'm kind of hoping that with this focus in these next two multiplayer games on the differentiation of different build archetypes, that they kind of lean into that more when we go back to making our builds with actual numbers, like an RPG. To sum it all up, I'm just excited that they're trying so many different things in these next two games, both on the multiplayer front and on like the build differentiation front, that I'm really just hoping to see a lot of these things folded back into their main Souls titles. Elden Ring feels like this pinnacle, and it's also described as this pinnacle of everything that they've been doing for a really long time. I'm kind of hoping that the next full-fledged Souls title also is combining a lot of the stuff that they've been trying out in these next two games that aren't even out yet. That's right, I'm talking about a third theoretical game that is probably only in pre-production right now. So even if I never get to play the Duskbloods, even if it remains a console exclusive from now until the end of time like Bloodborne is, I'm still excited just to see like what direction Fromsoft seems to be moving in with that game. Alright, let me ask one more question here. Why the hell is every studio making an extraction game right now? Since I started writing this script, 2 new extraction shooters have been announced, one of which I actually worked on and think is quite fun, because how much it leans into not just being a shooter, but I also think it's going to get drowned out by all these other studios hopping on the extraction trend. And what's crazy is that so many of these extraction shooters seem to have zero new ideas as to what might make the genre fun. I was watching the gameplay breakdown of Marathon and couldn't figure out what about the game was actually unique, except that it's being made by Bungie, a studio whose brand has long stopped being the draw that they think it is. Anyways, the longer I wait to record this video, the more PvPvE games come out, and they're literally all just extraction shooters, which is insane to me. Like, apparently, that's what the hell Let Loose devs are up to these days. Real quick, let's list a bunch of them. Arc Raiders, from the devs who made the finals. Marathon, from Bungie. Wildgate, from a bunch of former Overwatch 2 and Blizzard devs. Project Black Budget, from the devs who took over PUBG from PlayerUnknown's original team. Hunger, an extraction shooter from the devs of Hell Let Loose. Delta Force, which is rebooting the Delta Force IP for an extraction shooter. The mercifully canceled Respawn extraction shooter that a few publications have reported on. I'm sure there's more. This is just like the list they came up with in 5 minutes. These games, like all trend chasers, are all pretty late to the party. Escape from Tarkov and Hunt Showdown have been going strong for years already. And the Duskbloods isn't even the first melee-oriented extraction game. Dungeonborn and Dark and Darker have also been going for a few years as well. So, why this big shift towards extraction games in the industry? The first reason, I think, is because executives think this is the next Battle Royale trend, and they all want to be crowned the next Fortnite. The problem is, I don't think this is anywhere near as popular as Battle Royales are. I think all of these games and all these studios are crowding into a niche that really only has room for like 1 or 2 new games. It does not have room for like 6 or 7 new titles, and I think this is going to get a lot of people fired. But why extraction shooters, right? To me, this means that I think devs, or at least game companies, want more people to play PvP games, because that's the big moneymaker. But a lot of people just want to play PvE, which is very fair. I was one of those players for a very long time. So they try to draw that audience into PvP with the lure of the PvE aspect of that in these extraction games. At least that's what it feels like something like Marathon is attempting to do. The problem is that even if the game describes itself as PvEVP, the PvP part is almost always inevitable. And in fact, if you don't encounter any other players in one of those sessions, it's often very boring. I think generally it's a misreading of what players want in a game. If they see that extra P in PvEVP, they're just out. They're not going to buy it in the first place. I think games like Destiny understood this pretty well and made PvP an entirely different game mode, completely separate from its PvE with the exception of gear that you bring into each round, which makes it all the more baffling that they're now doubling down on PvP for the next game. This is also a time when Bungie desperately needs a hit. They are teetering on the brink of some pretty bad financials, And it's just like bizarre to me that they're like doubling down on PvP for their big moneymaker when they've spent the last 10 years building this like much broader audience through Destiny's really expansive PvE. I, of course, like what Fromsoft does with their PvP, which is pretend like it doesn't exist and spring it on you like a bear trap. Now you can't leave the PvP session, buddy. Better figure out how to swing your sword real good because the guy who invaded you sure does. Look, we all know people don't really like invasions, but that's how we all got into it, right? At some point we were invaded and we're like, hey, what the fuck? This feels illegal. And then there was something inherently compelling about that experience. I think that's what more AAA studios should do. Don't lead with, we're a PvP game. Lead with, we're a really good single player game that has PvP as a side thing. And then you occasionally lead your players into a forest full of bear traps and see them unwittingly get entangled in PvP. Some of them might get mad about this, sure, but gamers get mad about stupid shit all the time, even when it's good. Just look at all the people getting mad at the RNG and blueprints. It's a roguelike, motherfucker. The whole point is that the RNG makes things complex in ways you couldn't anticipate. That's like the whole point of the genre. Go back to the fucking Witness if you want to just like stare at a screen for like 2 hours until you figure out the puzzle. Gamers get mad when women in their dark fantasy role-playing games about slaying demon gods don't look like Sports Illustrated swimsuit models, and they complain so much that the devs, like the people at CI Games, actually make all the women in their games more attractive because they're a bunch of cowards. It's a Souls-like, motherfucker. Everyone is supposed to look like shit. That's how this works. I'm calling people lame for getting mad, and now I'm getting mad at people getting mad. I need to log off for a second, okay? Look, I'm not one of those people who advocate for invasions in every game. In fact, I think there's a lot of games out there that would be downright terrible with invasions because it directly clashes with the overall tone of the game. Invasions wouldn't really work in a game like Assassin's Creed, where it's just a power fantasy about killing as many people as possible and then morally justifying it with libertarian ideals and alternative history. Having your character killed by someone else's character would just fly in the face of that power fantasy. But in games where dying repeatedly is an expected outcome, it can work pretty damn well. I think a game like Duskbloods from Arcane Studios did this pretty well, but they also gave you no real incentive to participate in PvP in the first place, and also allowed you to toggle invasions off entirely, which I found a bit lame. I'm not entirely sure where the extraction craze originated. I know people point to Hunt Showdown or Tarkov being the name brands in the extraction shooter genre, but I'm not sure where that basic premise originated from. My first exposure to it was through Ubisoft's The Division, which was an insanely mediocre game for a variety of reasons, but had this one area called the Dark Zone, where you could take your build from PvE and go into a PvP zone and quite literally extract high value and rare loot from that zone. This was a really cool idea in what was overall not a good game in the slightest, and unfortunately didn't have a lot of staying power because the game itself had no real staying power. But I'm so disappointed this idea never made its way into like other Ubisoft games that are more fun than the Division series, or even a game made by a more interesting studio. I think there's something that's just so very compelling about taking your build that you've crafted and formed some sort of emotional attachment to in PvE and taking that into a PvP setting, but apparently very few people hit on that in general. I think that's what the extraction shooter like fantasy is trying to hit on. For other examples, I think like Sea of Thieves is a game that I thought had a really cool mix of PvE and PvP and fit the style and general vibes of being a pirate really well. I think there's something fundamentally flawed about how Sea of Thieves plays out in practice that a lot of devs want to put their own spin on with this extraction craze. For one, Sea of Thieves PvE is stupidly simple and was universally panned at launch, but just the constant looming threat of getting your ship smashed to smithereens by another ship made these like very boring, like really what they were fetch quests, and made those into like these much more daring and thrilling treasure hunts. My point in this long detour is to highlight how I think Fromsoft hit on this crossover between PvP and PvE over a decade ago with their invasions in Demon's Souls. They've gone back and forth on the conditions of getting invaded, the incentives for invading, etc., but what's remained constant is that once you do get invaded, the invasion doesn't end until you complete the level or complete the invasion. Until Elden Ring, invasions were forced upon you in narrow hallways where the invader typically was blocking your progress, an obstacle that needed to be outsmarted or overcome. I think all of these studios that are trying to get PvE players into PvP via extraction shooters are missing the mark. These games are just PvP games with a PvE element, not the other way around. PvE players need a draw to play PvP, like exclusive or rare rewards that you can only obtain through PvP, which I think something like The Division's Dark Zone could offer. I think the Dark Souls series in general did a decent job with this, offering unique rewards that could only be obtained in PvP or through some very dedicated PvE play. The only other way to get PvE players into PvP is to force it on them, and while that did create us and our little fucked up community of bad red men, you cannot deny how unpopular invasion mechanics in general are to your average player. What I'm very curious about with the Duskbloods is how much of a PvP game is this really going to be? Is this going to be like The Division's Dark Zone or Sea of Thieves, where you can fight your PvE, grab your loot, and get the hell out of there, while under the threat of PvP but never actually engaging with it? Or is this going to be a Wildgate or Tarkov where this is played in rounds, and it's pretty damn unlikely you'll ever complete a match without engaging in PvP? From the one interview we have on the Duskbloods, Miyazaki mentioned some end conditions, one of which is like the last player standing, which to me means that there's going to be a lot of PvP. When one of the end conditions for a match is last player standing, people's sight just goes red and their thirst for blood reaches starving vampire levels. I saw this firsthand when working on Wildgate. Every time we introduced new people to the game, they would just immediately throw themselves at other players, ignoring but also many times at the expense of all other objectives of the game. It seems like it's kind of a safe bet that this is going to be a very PvP-centric game, and to be honest, I'm a little worried about everything surrounding the concept of roles Miyazaki has mentioned will go out the window when you have the option of stabbing another player with a sword. Look no further than Reds constantly killing Reds in Elden Ring's PvP. The blood sings sweetly indeed, even when there is no incentive for it. The roles idea sounds so very interesting to me in the context of a normal Souls game, and I'm just concerned that Fromsoft might take the wrong lesson away from this when everybody prioritizes being bloodthirsty towards each other instead of like performing their actual role. I'm just worried it's going to get ignored and Fromsoft is going to be like, oh, that didn't work, guess we'll never try that again. I'm worried that's how they viewed Covenants in the Souls games, and that like, oh, well, people didn't really like these. Like, maybe some people didn't really get them, and some people didn't really like them. But for a lot of other people, it was a huge compelling reason that we played PvP. So I'm hoping this roles thing that Miyazaki has talked about gives us more incentives to engage with other players and not just bloodthirsty PvP over and over again. I really am not super interested in a game that just turns into a deathmatch every single round. Well, that's kind of a lie. I would totally play that for a very long time, but I hope for the longevity of this game. I'm hoping roles become very important to the moment-to-moment gameplay of the Duskbloods. Let's return to a question I kind of touched on earlier in this video. Why did Nintendo seek out From Software and want a game of theirs put exclusively on the Switch? Well, they know FromSoft fans are probably going to buy whatever FromSoft makes. We FromSoft fans are like a nation of people who believe that their leader ascends to godhood the moment they take power, and that Miyazaki himself has been bestowed with the mandate of heaven, the divine right of gamers, which actually is a sentiment I find stupidly annoying among video essayists on the internet. FromSoft is no longer a company of like 100 developers, where our boy Hidetaka gets to oversee every little detail of the games, and the dev cycle of each game is like 2 years max. That's no longer a thing. As of June of last year, FromSoft employs over 400 developers and seems to have 3 games in active development at all times. I guess what I'm really saying here is to please stop being so weird about From Software, because I think you're all setting yourself up for failure. Miyazaki isn't the only reason FromSoft has been making bangers for a decade, but also know that the studio has steadily changed and will continue to change the larger it grows, the more games it makes and the less direct influence Miyazaki personally has on each game. please don't get super attached to brands of studios, because studios are only as good as the people they are made up of. Blizzard and BioWare don't make good games anymore, not because their developers got worse at making games, but because their talent left and was, honestly in some cases, actively driven out, and those companies failed to cultivate the same kind of talent they used to have. Someday the name Miyazaki might also mean very little to us. People used to worship Todd Howard like a god at Bethesda, but now he's just kind of a meme. I get sent that Photoshop picture of Todd holding a gun telling me to buy Skyrim again like once a month by my unfunny IRL friends. And while I'm writing this script, Bethesda just re-released another one of their older games. I actually think the Oblivion half remaster, half remake looks kind of cool. I might pick it up on sale one of these days, but come on, like, the memes write themselves nowadays. One day, the fire will fade and only dark will remain. But one day, tiny flames will dance across the darkness, like embers linked by lords past. One day, Fromsoft will make a bad game. And no, not like Dark Souls 2 bad, like legitimately a bad game that critics will all agree sucks, not just be bullied into giving a good score by capital G gamers. It is the fate of every major game studio, and it will happen to our sacred cow as well. But there will be other games made by developers who were inspired by these games we loved, and that will make newer, better games. I think as studios move more towards modern AAA game sizes, it becomes harder and harder for them to make something that actually sparks joy in the player. Mostly because the bigger the game studio, the more beholden the vision of that game becomes to other, less artistic, more marketing-focused people. I think it's time we accept that our besties at From Software have reached AAA size. And with that size, the likelihood of that no good, terrible, very bad game grows. My advice to you, dear viewer, is this. Find an indie or AA studio that has made an interesting game, or two, and really dig into them. Try to find out what they're making next. Try to see what projects their developers have worked on in the past. Because those are the kind of studios that are going to make the next huge game. I remember in 2020, my friends and family thought I was fucking insane because all I would talk about was this game that didn't exist yet called Elden Ring that was in development. I know people on this channel are going to say Dark Souls was a pretty well-known series at that point, but it was kind of just known as that really hard game series. And now when I talk to anyone who plays games in real life, almost all of them have at least played 10 to 20 hours of Elden Ring, or I acknowledge how monumental it was. But this is something that happens kind of frequently these days. A few podcasters I listened to way back in 2018, 2019 wouldn't shut up about Divinity Original Sin 2. For years I heard rumblings about their next big project, and lo and behold, Baldur's Gate 3 is probably one of the biggest phenomenons of 2023, probably the biggest game that launched that year. Right now, there's a game being made that's going to blow you away in a few years. And let me tell you, that game isn't going to be made by Activision or Ubisoft or EA. As I almost always do at the ends of these videos, I'm begging you to just check out the indie game scene. It's the truest crucible of is this game fun? Because that's really the only way indie games can stand out and make money, pretty much entirely on their own merit by being spread by word of mouth. None of these games get real marketing budgets. Even the ones that do get marketing budgets have to be good, otherwise nobody would play them. So please play an indie game, or I'll recommend you one sometime soon. Let's talk about that a little bit more as this video wraps up. That's all I really had to say about the Duskbloods, Nightreign, From Software in general at the moment. Wanted to let you know about a few things that I'm working on. Considering streaming a little bit more. I want to do a thing where I kind of take 15 minutes of a 2-hour stream and just kind of dive into indie games that are coming out. I'm not really playing any of the games on stream because I don't think a whole lot of people want to watch that. But I'd love to just chat for 15 to 20 minutes about new games that are coming out that seem interesting, mostly focusing on indie and AA. So I'm hoping to stream that a little bit more. And then of course also like stream more invasions, more like seamless co-op stuff if people want to join in on that as well. I've been hearing people having a lot of fun with seamless co-op like playthroughs with friendly fire turned on, which makes like PvE much more interesting. I think it makes PvP much more interesting with that as well. So I'd be really down to do that sometime soon. Other than that, I'm soldiering on with my Age of Mage. I'm going to be making mage builds until like I stop playing Elden Ring. Like I've said a million times, I feel like that's the most fun way to play Elden Ring. And I don't think they're going to add anything in this like Tarnished edition that is going to change my mind. I'm also really looking forward to Nightreign. Initially, I was not that stoked about it, and then I've seen like more and more stuff that they're putting out about like the different abilities and movement systems of each class, and I'm getting more excited about that. I think it has a lot of potential for what Fromsoft can do with mages, like the mage archetype, the ranger archetype, the strength archetype. I think those are all like really cool ideas that they're exploring, and I'm stoked to play a lot of that game. I don't know if I'll make any videos about it. I might play it on stream with some other folks. We'll see. And lastly here, I was kind of thinking about this when the Duskbloods got announced as like this, you know, Switch 2 exclusive. And I was just thinking about the next time I'm going to play like a full-fledged FromSoft game. Like what we think of as like a true Souls-like, like the Dark Souls series or Elden Ring. That's probably going to be a while from now. Probably like 2027 at the soonest. And I was just like trying to think about where I'm going to be in my life in like 2027. Like I think I'm going to be over 30. I think by then I might have a kid. And I think like I'm just going to be at a very different phase of my life by the time the next full-fledged FromSoft video comes out. And I was just kind of wondering to myself, you know, by the time that happens, am I still going to be making videos on YouTube? Am I still going to be like playing a ton of PvP? It's hard to know. I just think there's a good chance that this channel like maybe still exists, but just isn't making videos anymore by the time the next full-fledged Souls title comes out. And that's really okay with me, because if I'm not making videos, it's because I'm probably too busy. So I'm mostly bringing this up because I just want to take a second to let you all know how much I appreciate you. The comments on the videos, people in my Discord, I just really appreciate y'all and the kind of community that's been around for the last like 6 years I've been doing this. I don't really have any plans to stop making videos as of right now, but I guess I just wanted to say this stuff before it's too late, you know, before I get too busy and like run out of time to make videos about FromSoft games. But anyways, that's all from me guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.